My mother grabbed my 7-year-old daughter by the arm in the middle of the grocery store and hit her across the back of her hand for reaching toward a candy display. Lily screamed, not a tantrum scream, a pain scream, the kind that cuts through a whole building, and every person within 30 feet turned to look. I stood there, 3 feet away, holding a box of cereal completely frozen. My mother had done things like this my whole life. She had pinched me under tables, pulled my hair in parking lots, left marks on my wrist that I covered with bracelets in elementary school. I knew this woman. I knew exactly what she was capable of. But seeing it happen to my daughter, in front of a refrigerated dairy case in a Kroger on a Thursday afternoon, something in my chest just stopped. And then my 9-year-old son, Daniel, who had been standing quietly to my left holding a box of crackers, set those crackers down on the nearest shelf with both hands, turned around without saying a single word, and walked to the customer service desk at the front of the store. I watched him go. I did not stop him. My mother was already composing herself, straightening her cardigan, saying something about children needing to learn discipline. And then the police arrived. Some people in my family still think I went too far. They say I should have handled it privately, kept it in the house, protected her. After everything you are about to hear, I want to know what you think. Let me tell you how we got here. My name is Nora Scott. I am 38 years old. My daughter Lily turned 7 in February. My son Daniel is 9. Their father and I separated when Lily was 18 months old, and I have had primary custody since the divorce was finalized. I rebuilt everything after that, professionally, financially, emotionally, and I did it largely without help from my mother, Renata Scott, who made it very clear from the beginning that she considered my divorce a personal failure she was embarrassed to be associated with. My mother is not a cruel woman in the way people imagine cruelty. She does not yell. She does not throw things. She is precise and controlled, and she uses words the way a surgeon uses a scalpel, with calculation, at the exact right moment, in the exact place that will cause the most specific damage. Growing up, I was her primary project. I was never quite right. My grades were nearly perfect, but not perfect. My clothes were appropriate, but not impressive. My friends were fine, but not the right kind of fine. She never missed an opportunity to point out the gap between what I was and what she had imagined I would be. When I went into real estate at 26, she told my Aunt Helen that I had chosen a career with no ceiling. When I got my first commission check for $42,000 on a commercial lease in the spring of my second year, I did not tell her. I put it in a savings account I had opened at a bank across town that she had never heard of, and I went to her house that Sunday for dinner. And I sat across from her while she told me that her friend Donna's daughter had just gotten a position at a law firm downtown, and I smiled and said that sounded wonderful. My mother's signature tell, the one I learned to read before I learned long division, is the way she smooths the front of her blouse when she is preparing to say something she has already decided cannot be argued with. She does it with the flat of her palm, one slow stroke downward, and then whatever comes next is presented as settled fact. She smoothed her blouse at that dinner and told me that real estate was fine for now, but that I should consider something with benefits. I drove home that night and transferred another $2,000 into that account. That was the first thing I built without her knowledge, and it would not be the last. The pattern of my life with my mother had always followed the same arc. She would observe. She would assess. She would find the gap between where I was and where she thought I should be, and she would insert herself into that gap with the certainty of someone who had convinced herself that her involvement was love. When I was in college, she called my academic advisor without telling me to ask whether I was on track for graduation. When I moved into my first apartment, she told the building manager I was her daughter and asked about the lease terms before I had signed anything. When I got engaged the first time, to a man named Curtis who was kind and funny and entirely wrong for me in ways it took me 2 years to fully understand, she told me at my own engagement dinner that she thought I was settling, and then she apologized by saying she just wanted better for me than she had. That was how she operated. The damage and the justification arrived together in the same sentence, inseparable. But the incidents that mattered, the ones that created the version of me sitting in that Kroger aisle watching the police walk through the automatic doors, those came later. 3 of them, specifically. The first happened 6 months after my divorce. I had just taken on a new territory with the commercial real estate firm where I was building my portfolio, and I was managing 2 active listings, both in the high hundreds of thousands. My mother called on a Tuesday morning and asked if I had applied for the bookkeeper position at her friend Gerald Fong's accounting practice. She had already spoken to Gerald. She had already mentioned my name. She told me it was a good, stable job with health coverage, and that it would be a better foundation for the kids than commission work. I was sitting in my car outside a building I was about to tour with a potential buyer whose offer, if it came in, would generate more than my mother had earned in the previous 4 years combined. I told her I would think about it. She told me not to wait too long because Gerald was interviewing that week. I hung up, walked into the building, and closed a $163,000 deal 11 days later. I did not tell her. If you have ever been counted out by someone who should have known better, you know exactly what that silence feels like. The second incident happened at Christmas 2 years later. My mother had invited what she described as the whole family, which meant her side, which meant my Aunt Helen and Helen's husband Ray, my cousin Bridget, who had recently started a medical residency in orthopedics and had become my mother's primary example of what a daughter could be, and my grandmother Estella, who was 81 and sharp and quiet, and who had watched my mother her entire life with the same expression a person wears when they are watching a storm they cannot stop. We were all at my mother's dining room table. Lily was 4 and Daniel was 6, and they were in the living room watching a movie because my mother had a strict policy about children at the dinner table before they could carry a conversation she found tolerable. Bridget was talking about her fellowship application. My mother was listening with both hands wrapped around her wine glass, nodding in the way she nodded when she was collecting evidence of someone else's accomplishment to compare against mine later. Then she turned to me across the table and asked, in front of everyone, whether I was still doing the real estate thing, not the real estate work or my career. The thing, I told her yes. She turned back to Bridget. My grandmother Estella looked at me from the other end of the table, and her expression did not change, but she reached across and pressed 2 fingers to the back of my hand for exactly 2 seconds before she picked up her fork again. That was the whole moment, but it was enough. What my mother did not know, what none of them knew at that table, was that 6 weeks before that Christmas dinner, I had met with an attorney named David Ewan, a family law and estate planning attorney with a firm on the north side of the city. The consultation had been about setting up a trust structure for my children's finances, primarily to protect the college fund I had been building for both of them for 3 years. The account for Daniel already had $61,000 in it. Lily's had $44,000. The meeting with David had lasted 2 hours, and we had not finished, and we had a second appointment scheduled for the second week of January. The thing my mother told me over Christmas dinner, the thing she implied with the word thing, with the way she turned back to Bridget before I had finished answering, was that what I was doing did not count as a real career. What she did not know was that I had already begun building a legal structure around my children's future that she would have no access to and no voice in, and I had done it because I had started, quietly, to understand that her involvement in my life was not going to diminish on its own. The third incident is harder to describe because it was smaller and more specific, and because of the 3, it is the one I think about most. Daniel was 7. He had just started 2nd grade, and his teacher, Ms. Arajo, had told me in a conference in September that he had a particular gift for pattern recognition, and that she thought he should be assessed for the district's advanced learning program. The assessment required a parent signature and a formal referral from the school, and I had filled out the paperwork that same week. My mother came to visit that Saturday. She came every other Saturday, ostensibly to spend time with the children, in practice to audit my apartment and report her findings to Helen, and she found the assessment paperwork on my kitchen counter. She reviewed it for longer than she needed to. Then she set it down and told me that she had heard mixed things about the advanced program, that it put too much pressure on children, and that she had read an article. I asked her which article. She smoothed the front of her blouse. She said she did not remember the specific source, but that she felt strongly it was not the right environment for Daniel. I nodded. I picked up the paperwork, put it in my bag, and dropped it at the school Monday morning with my signature on every page. Daniel was assessed the following month. He tested into the program with scores in the 94th percentile. I told my mother about the results in a text message. She responded with a thumbs-up emoji and said she hoped it would not add too much stress. These three incidents are the foundation. They are why, by the time my mother walked into that Kroger on a Thursday in late October, I was not the same person she had been managing since 1986. I had built something. Not loudly. Not in front of her. But it was there, and it was solid, and it was mine. Now let me tell you about what I built, and how close she came to never knowing any of it. The foundation started the way most things I have built started, quietly, specifically, and because someone underestimated me at exactly the wrong moment. 3 years after my divorce, I was generating consistent commission income from commercial real estate, enough to live on comfortably and to fund the children's accounts. But the work was variable, and I was tired of variable. A colleague of mine at the firm, a woman named Beatrice Huang who was 12 years older than me, and who had once told me over lunch that the only thing she regretted was not moving into property ownership sooner, introduced me to a financial advisor named James Acaffer. James worked with a group that focused on investment property acquisition for individual investors. He was direct, he did not explain things twice, and in our first meeting he told me that given my income and my current savings, I was approximately 2 years away from being able to acquire a first investment property without overextending myself. I found that 2-year timeline very motivating. Over the next 23 months, I did not change anything visible about my life. I drove the same car. I lived in the same apartment. My mother continued to come every other Saturday. I continued to sit across from her and absorb her assessments of my choices without correction. But I was meeting with James every quarter, and I was making specific adjustments to my financial position that added up slowly, and then all at once in the way these things do. The investment property conversation became serious in January, approximately 2 years ago. James sent me 3 options, all multifamily residential, all within a 30-minute drive of my apartment, all in the range I had been targeting. The one I chose was a duplex on Mercer Lane, purchased for $420,000. I put down $84,000, which represented most of what I had built in the account across town over the preceding years, and I financed the rest through a lender James connected me with. I closed in March, 18 months before the afternoon in the grocery store. My mother did not know this property existed. I also, in that same month, had my second meeting with David Ewan, the attorney, which had been building for months. The trust structure for Daniel and Lily's accounts was formalized in March as well. David had been patient with me about the timeline because the paperwork required specific financial disclosure documents that my divorce agreement had complicated slightly. But by March it was done, the trust was established, the children's college accounts were protected inside it, and I was the sole trustee. No one else had access or authority. No one else's signature was required for anything. I told no one in my family about the property or the trust. Not because I was hiding from them strategically, or not only because of that, but because I had watched my mother involve herself in every financial decision I had ever made in her presence, and I was not willing to give her a surface to push against. She could not object to what she did not know. That spring, the property on Mercer Lane began generating rental income. Both units were occupied within 6 weeks of closing. The combined monthly rent came in at $3,040. After the mortgage, insurance, and management fee to the property company Beatrice had recommended, I was clearing approximately $800 a month. It was not life-changing money. But it was the first passive income I had ever generated, and it was mine, and it was growing. The close call came in May, about 2 months after closing, during one of my mother's Saturday visits. She arrived at 2 in the afternoon with a bag of groceries she had not told me she was bringing and a particular energy I had learned over the years to identify as investigative. She wanted to help, she said. She had noticed that I seemed tired lately. She was going to make dinner. She began moving through my kitchen with the efficiency of someone who has decided the best way to get information is to occupy your space until you become comfortable enough to reveal it. Daniel was at a birthday party. Lily was at my kitchen table working on a drawing. My mother put groceries away, made observations about the state of my refrigerator, and then paused at the counter where I had left a folder from James Acaffer. She did not touch it. But she read the return address label on the envelope underneath it, which had the name of the property management company. Her hand stilled on the counter. "What is Mercer Properties?" I was at the sink. I turned the water off. I turned around slowly. "Property management company," I said. I looked into having someone manage a rental for a client who was interested. She looked at me for a long moment. Her hand went to the front of her blouse. She smoothed it once. A client had you managing their rental property? Research only, I said. They ended up not going through with it. She nodded in a way that meant she was not satisfied but had not found enough to push on. She went back to the groceries. Lily looked up from her drawing and said, "Mama, can I have the purple crayon?" And my mother handed her the purple crayon from the cup on the counter without breaking stride, and that was the end of it. But it was not, for her, really the end of it. I could feel her recalibrating as she cooked. She asked, carefully, about my workload. She asked whether I was thinking about the holidays and whether we might do Thanksgiving at our house this year. She asked whether Daniel's advanced program was going well, and when I said it was, she said she was glad, though her tone suggested she was still waiting to be proven right about the pressure. I smiled through all of it. I helped set the table. I let her feed my children and I thanked her for dinner. And the following Monday, I called David Ewan and asked him to add a notation to the trust documentation about the Mercer Lane property, specifically establishing it as a trust asset that would be managed for the children's benefit in the event of my incapacitation. David said he would have the updated documents ready by the end of the following week. I drove to his office on a Wednesday afternoon and signed them while Lily was in school and Daniel was in his after-school program, and I was back at my desk by 3:15. That was how that close call ended. Not with confrontation, not with revelation. With a document, signed quietly, in an office my mother had never visited. The second close call happened in August, 3 months before the grocery store. My cousin Bridget had finished her residency and taken a position at a hospital in the city, which meant she was suddenly present at family events in a way she had not been for years. Bridget and I had never been close, not because of dislike, but because my mother had spent so many years using Bridget as a measuring stick that there was a kind of charged awkwardness between us neither of us had ever fully worked through. But Bridget was fundamentally decent. She had her mother Helen's tendency to defer to whoever had the most authority in the room, which in our family meant she deferred to my mother almost automatically, but she was not unkind. My mother hosted a dinner in August, nominally to celebrate Bridget's new position, functionally to gather the family in a room and remind everyone of the correct hierarchy. Helen and Ray came. My grandmother Estella came. I came with Daniel and Lily. Bridget arrived late, which my mother noted without saying anything directly about it, the way she notes things. After dinner, the children had gone to the living room, and the adults were at the table with wine, and my grandmother Estella was talking about her apartment. She had been thinking about downsizing, and my mother said that perhaps Estella should talk to Nora about it since Nora was in real estate, and she said it in the tone she sometimes used when she was complimenting me in a way that also categorized me, like saying a mechanic is good with their hands. And then Ray, my Aunt Helen's husband Ray, who worked in commercial insurance and who rarely said anything of substance at family dinners, looked at me and said, "Aren't you the one who closed that Mercer deal? Beatrice Huang mentioned your name at a thing I was at last month." The table went quiet in the specific way a table goes quiet when a piece of information has arrived that nobody was expecting. My mother's hand moved toward the front of her blouse and stopped halfway. She looked at Ray. Ray looked at me with the uncomplicated expression of a man who had no idea he had just dropped a live wire into a room. "You know Beatrice," I said. "She was at our industry dinner. Mentioned she had a client who picked up a duplex on Mercer Lane, said it was a sharp move." He looked at Helen. "I assumed everyone knew." "Everyone knew what?" my mother said. Her voice was completely level. That was how I knew she was not just curious. When my mother is casually curious, her voice has a warmth to it, a social register she has perfected over decades. When she is actually trying to get information, her voice goes flat and precise, the way it had gone right now. I picked up my wine glass. "I bought an investment property in March," I said. "It's a duplex. It's been rented since April." Bridget looked at her plate. Helen looked at Ray. Ray, finally reading the room, developed a sudden interest in the tablecloth. My mother looked at me for a long moment. I could see her processing not just the information, but the fact that I had not told her, and the further fact that I had told her now only because Ray had left me no other option. Her expression did not change. She set her glass down carefully. "You didn't mention it," she said. "I mentioned it just now. Before now. I don't always announce my business decisions." Her hand completed the journey to her blouse, one slow stroke downward. An investment property is not a business decision you keep private from your family. I keep my financial information private from everyone, I said. That's called being an adult. Bridget made a small sound that might have been a suppressed laugh or an intake of breath. My grandmother Estella raised her wine glass and drank from it without expression. My mother did not pursue it further that night. She redirected the conversation to Estella's apartment situation, and she was gracious and useful and organized for the remainder of the evening, and she hugged me at the door and said she was glad I was doing well, and the hug was exactly as long as it always was, not a second longer or shorter. But driving home with the children asleep in the back seat, I could feel the shift. She had not known about the property. She had not known about the trust. She was now recalibrating again, and this time she had more information to work with, and I knew her well enough to know that the recalibration would eventually produce something. I just did not know what form it would take. I called David Ewan the next morning and asked him to make sure all documentation was complete and in order. He confirmed that it was. I asked him to scan everything and send me a secure copy to keep offsite. He had it to me by end of day. I also, that week, called Lily's pediatric specialist, Dr. Amara Osai, who had been managing Lily's mild auditory processing issues since she was 3. And I confirmed that all of Lily's health coverage was current and that the plan I carried through my work was up to date. Lily's therapy sessions, which met twice monthly at Dr. Osai's clinic, were covered under that plan and under a supplemental policy I had added the previous year. I was the policyholder. No one else was listed. No one else could change, access, or revoke the coverage. I do not know exactly why I made those calls that week specifically. My mother had not done anything. She had asked a question at dinner and I had answered it. But something in me had shifted in that dining room when her hand went to her blouse and her voice went flat, and the shift felt like a warning I needed to take seriously. Everything I had built was quiet and documented and legal and mine. And I had no idea at that point that within 3 months I would need all of it. The timing couldn't have been worse. Or maybe, looking back now, it was exactly right. The Thursday in late October started like most Thursdays that involved my mother. She called at 8:45 in the morning to confirm the time, which she already knew, and to mention twice that she had made Lily's favorite cookies, the almond ones with the powdered sugar, as though this would establish goodwill in advance of whatever she had planned. I told her we would be there at 11. She said she would have lunch ready at noon. That was the whole call. It took 4 minutes and left me with the specific tightness in my chest that I associated with any scheduled time in her presence. The plan had been simple: grocery run first, then her house for lunch. She lived 12 minutes from a Kroger I liked, so it made logistical sense. I had the children with me because it was a Thursday, which was my full day with them, and Daniel had asked if he could come in instead of waiting in the car because he wanted to pick out his own cereal. Lily wanted to come because Daniel was going. That was how it worked between them. They had that 7- and 9-year-old solidarity that I had loved watching develop over the past 2 years, Daniel protective without being overbearing, Lily following his lead with a confidence she got nowhere else but from him. My mother had driven separately and met us in the parking lot. She had a list of her own and said she would walk through with us. This was, in retrospect, a decision I should have questioned. My mother in a grocery store with my children was not a new dynamic, but it was one I had always managed with careful attention, the way you manage any situation where the variables are familiar and the risk is low but not zero. I was managing it. And then I stopped paying attention for 60 seconds while I was looking at a display of pasta, and in those 60 seconds, my mother and Lily had moved half an aisle ahead of me, and Lily had reached for a candy bar from a low shelf the way 7-year-olds reach for things, instinctively, openly, without guile, and my mother grabbed her arm and hit the back of her hand with a flat smack that I heard from where I was standing. Lily's scream was not a tantrum. It was not a child performing distress for effect. It was the involuntary, unfiltered sound of pain and shock, and it landed in that grocery store aisle like a struck bell. I was frozen for what felt like a long time, but was probably 3 or 4 seconds, long enough for my mother to begin composing herself, for several nearby shoppers to turn and look, and for Daniel to set his cereal box down on the nearest shelf with both hands and walk toward the front of the store. I did not stop him. I did not know in that moment what he was doing. I would find out very quickly. My mother was straightening her cardigan. Children need to understand, she began, in the tone she reserved for her most settled convictions, that you don't simply take things. Lily was holding her hand against her chest. She was not crying yet. She was in that suspended state that comes just before tears, the one where a child is still deciding whether what happened was real. I crossed the 3 feet between us and crouched down to her level. Her hand was red across the knuckles. Mama, her voice was small. It hurt. I know, baby. I kept my voice steady. I stood up. My mother was looking at me with the expression she used when she expected me to agree with her. A small nod forward, eyebrows slightly raised, waiting for me to acknowledge that the lesson had been appropriate. I did not acknowledge it. Renata. I used her first name deliberately, the way I had only done twice before in my entire life. Her eyebrows moved a fraction higher. We are leaving this store. I need you to go to your car. I was correcting her behavior. That is what grandmothers do. No, I said, it is not. She opened her mouth. She closed it. Her hand went to her blouse and then, because she was in public, she stopped herself mid-gesture and let it fall. That was the moment I saw it, not just the familiar pattern of control and justification, but the calculation underneath it. She had done this to Lily the way she had done things to me my whole childhood. Quickly, privately, without witnesses who mattered. Except this time Daniel had been there, and the store was full of people, and I was not 8 years old, and I had stopped being willing to manage her behavior quietly somewhere around the second time she had smoothed that blouse in front of me with that particular palm-down finality. I took Lily's hand. I turned to look for Daniel. He was at the customer service desk at the front of the store, speaking quietly to a manager in a blue vest, and I understood immediately what he had done. What I did not know, what I found out later from Daniel himself, in the car on the way home, was that he had not asked the manager to call anyone. He had simply said, in his careful 9-year-old way, that he thought someone should know that his grandmother had hit his sister in aisle 7. The manager had called the police on his own initiative. That was Daniel. He had assessed the situation, identified the appropriate authority, and reported to it. He had not yelled, not run, not made a scene. He had done exactly what I had always told both of my children to do when something was wrong and they needed help from an adult. Find someone responsible and use your words. The officers arrived within 6 minutes. 2 of them, a man and a woman, both in uniform. The woman came to me first. She crouched down to Lily's level and asked her name. Lily told her. The officer asked if she was hurt. Lily showed her the back of her hand, which was still red. The officer looked at it for a moment, then stood and looked at me. Behind us, my mother was standing very still. She had not moved since the officers walked through the automatic doors. For the first time in recent memory, her hand was not moving toward her blouse. I called David Ewan from the parking lot while the officers were still inside taking a statement from the store manager and from my mother. He did not answer, so I left a message that was approximately 40 seconds long and contained the words physical harm, my daughter, and I need to know my options today. I then called a number I had saved in my phone 7 months earlier and never used, the number for a family law attorney named Claudia Ferreira, who had been referred to me by David as the person to call if a custody or protective order situation ever became relevant. Claudia answered on the second ring. "This is Nora Scott," I said. "David Ewan referred me. I need to talk about a protective order for my daughter." There was a pause on her end. Not hesitation, assessment. "Tell me what happened today," I told her. I stood in the Kroger parking lot while my children sat in my car with the doors locked and the heat on, and I told Claudia Ferreira everything that had happened in the preceding 25 minutes. When I finished, she was quiet for 3 seconds. "Are police on scene now?" "Yes." "Give a complete statement. Do not minimize anything. Ask the officers what documentation they are creating and get a case number before you leave." "Okay." "Call me back this afternoon. We are going to talk about exactly what options exist here, and some of them move very fast." A beat. "You did the right thing calling." I hung up and got the case number from the responding officer before she left the parking lot. My mother had been told that the matter was being documented and that she might be contacted for further follow-up. She did not look at me when she walked to her car. She had never, in my entire life, not looked at me when she walked away from me. She always looked. She was always assessing, always evaluating, always making sure the last image I carried was one she had curated. She did not look this time. I drove home. I did not go to her house for lunch. The almond cookies stayed there. If you are still with me, stay, because what I did next is the reason I am telling you this story. Claudia Ferreira was methodical in a way that made me feel, for the first time in weeks, like the ground under me was solid. Our call that afternoon lasted 51 minutes. She walked me through the documentation that had been created at the scene, the pathway toward a protective order, and the specific legal standard that applied to my situation. She also told me something I had not known: that my mother, as a biological grandparent with an established relationship with the children, had a potential legal basis to petition for visitation rights in our state, which meant that any action I took needed to be documented carefully from the start. "The incident today gives you a strong foundation," Claudia said. "But I want a record that makes this impossible to dispute later. That means a written timeline from you, any witness information from the store, and the officer's report. I can have all of that. I also want to know about any prior incidents, anything that happened before today that was documented or that had witnesses." I thought about the 3 incidents I had carried for years: the bookkeeper suggestion, the Christmas dinner, the Saturday visit with the folder on the counter. None of them were documented. None of them had witnesses who had paid attention. They were just things I knew, in the specific way you know things that were done quietly and with precision. "Not formally," I said, "but I can write everything down." "Do that. Everything, dates, what was said, who was present, even things you think are too small. Send it to me by Friday." I spent Thursday evening after the children were in bed writing 12 pages. I typed it on my laptop at the kitchen table, and I did not stop until I had written every incident I could recall that involved my mother and my children. Not just the events that felt significant, but the small ones, the accumulative ones, the ones that individually would have seemed like an overreaction to object to, but together formed a pattern that I had been documenting in my own memory for years without realizing I was doing it. Daniel knocked on my bedroom door at 10 that night. He was supposed to be asleep. "Mama, you should be in bed, bud." He stood in the doorway in his socks. "Is Grandma going to get in trouble?" I thought about how to answer that. I thought about the age-appropriate version and the complete version and found that they were not very different. "Yes," I said, "she is." He nodded once, the way he nodded when something was confirmed that he had already worked out on his own. "She shouldn't have done that to Lily." "No, she shouldn't have." I didn't know if I did the right thing. I looked at my son in the doorway, 9 years old, standing in his socks on a Thursday night because he needed to know whether his decision had been correct. I crossed the room and put my hand on his shoulder. "You did exactly the right thing," I said. "Exactly." He went back to his room. I went back to my laptop and kept writing until midnight. Claudia filed for the protective order the following Tuesday. The hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out, which gave me what felt like an unbearably long window, but which Claudia explained was standard. In the meantime, my mother called my phone 3 times in the first 4 days. I did not answer. She called my Aunt Helen once, who called me, uncertain and careful, to say that Renata was upset and wanted to talk. "I know she's upset," I said. "Nora, she's your mother." "Helen," I kept my voice even. "Your sister hit my 7-year-old in a grocery store." "The police were called. There is a case number. If she wants to talk about something, she can talk to my attorney." Helen was quiet for a long moment. I heard her exhale. "I didn't know it had gotten to that point." "I know you didn't." That was the most I said to anyone in my family for 3 weeks. Not because I was building towards something dramatic, I was not. I was gathering documents, meeting with Claudia, answering every question she asked with complete honesty, and waiting for a court date. The confrontation, when it came, did not happen in a dining room with wine glasses and a table full of family. It happened in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building downtown, with a court mediator present, and it lasted 4 hours. My mother brought her own attorney, a man named Gerald Whitfield, not the Gerald Fong she had mentioned years ago for the bookkeeper job, but a different Gerald, which struck me as a coincidence so specific it felt invented, who specialized in family law and grandparent rights. I had not known she was going to do this. Claudia had anticipated it. "She's going to try to turn this around," Claudia had told me the night before. "She is going to say that you are using this incident to cut off access, that the incident was minor, that she has an established relationship with the children that the court should protect. She will not admit fault. She will position herself as the victim of an overreaction." "And what do we do?" Claudia looked at me across her desk. "We let her make her case, and then we show them everything you wrote down." My mother arrived with Gerald Whitfield and with my Aunt Helen, who had apparently agreed to attend as a character witness. My grandmother Estella was not there. I had wondered, in the days leading up to this, whether Estella knew what was happening. I had not contacted her. I did not know if my mother had. She was 81 and lived alone and had always watched my mother with that particular quiet expression, and I did not want to pull her into the middle of this. The mediator, a woman named Dr. Renee Aguilar, who had gray streaks in her hair and a voice that was almost entirely without inflection, welcomed everyone and explained the process. This was a mediation session, not a court proceeding. Nothing said today was binding unless a written agreement was reached and signed. The purpose was to explore whether a resolution could be reached without a full hearing. My mother sat across the table from me. Her hands were folded on the surface. She was wearing a dark blue blazer I recognized. She looked composed. Gerald Whitfield opened by saying that his client deeply regretted the incident at the grocery store and understood that it had been distressing for everyone involved. He said the word incident 3 times in his first 2 minutes, and each time he used it, I felt Claudia, seated next to me, make a small note on her legal pad. My client would like to address the family relationship history and context, Whitfield continued, because we believe this situation has been mischaracterized as something more serious than it was, and that severing contact between my client and her grandchildren would cause significant and documentable harm to those children. Dr. Aguilar nodded. She looked at Claudia. Claudia set a folder on the table. Have the police report from the October incident, the responding officer's field notes, a written statement from the store manager, and the medical documentation from Dr. Amara Osai's office noting the mark observed on Lily's hand when she was brought in the following morning. She opened the folder. We also have a 12-page written timeline prepared by my client detailing incidents over a period of approximately 9 years. We would like to begin with the October event and then present the pad. My mother's eyes moved to the folder, just briefly, then back to Claudia's face. The October event has been characterized as a minor discipline incident, Claudia continued, and now her voice carried a specific weight that I had not heard from her before. A 7-year-old child was struck. The force was sufficient to leave visible redness across her knuckles, confirmed by her pediatrician the following day. A 9-year-old child, observing the incident, believed it warranted calling law enforcement. He was correct. The police responded, documented the incident, and assigned a case number. She slid a copy of the report to the center of the table. That case number is active. Whitfield looked at it. He picked it up. 2 seconds, 3-4. He set it back down. Something shifted in his posture, not dramatically, not the way it happens in movies. He just became slightly less forward. My mother's hands, still folded on the table, pressed together harder. We acknowledge the event, Whitfield said. My client has expressed remorse. She has not expressed remorse to my client directly. Claudia's tone remained level. She has called my client's phone 3 times without leaving a message and has contacted a family member to request a conversation, which my client declined pending legal process. Remorse, in this context, requires acknowledgement of harm and a commitment to non-repetition. Neither has been formally expressed. My mother unfolded her hands. One of them moved toward the front of her blazer and then stilled entirely, as though she had caught herself mid-gesture and decided against it. She looked at Whitfield. He looked at his legal pad. I would like to speak, my mother said. Dr. Aguilar looked at Claudia, who nodded. My mother looked at me across the table. Her voice was measured. Nora, I have been present in those children's lives since the day they were born. I have given time and energy and care that does not appear on any document in any folder. One moment in which my correction was perhaps too firm, does not erase years of commitment. I let her finish. Then, the correction was not too firm. You hit my daughter, she screamed. A stranger's child would have prompted the same police response from the same store manager. You were not perfect either, growing up. I'm not claiming to be perfect. I kept my voice steady. I had practiced keeping my voice steady for weeks. I'm sitting in this room because you hit a 7-year-old child. That is the only reason we're here. My Aunt Helen, seated slightly behind and to the right of my mother, pressed the fingertips of both hands to the table. She was not looking at anyone. Her thumbnail was doing a small, repetitive scraping motion against the table's edge that she probably did not know she was doing. Let me show you the next document, Claudia said. The timeline I had written, 12 pages, single-spaced, chronological, was summarized in a 4-page exhibit that Claudia had prepared. She walked through it section by section. The incidents from my own childhood, which established pattern. The incident at the Christmas dinner 2 years ago when my mother had dismissed my career in front of the family. The Saturday visit with the folder. The 3 incidents I had named as the foundation of everything that followed. Whitfield was writing. He had been writing since the timeline went on the table. My mother was not writing. She was looking at the pages, and her expression had changed in a way I had seen only twice before in my life. Once when my father had told her, 3 weeks before he left for good, that he was done pretending, and once when I had told her, at 29, that I was filing for divorce. It was not grief. It was not anger. It was the specific look of a person who is processing the realization that the version of events they have been telling themselves is not the version that exists on paper. "Counsel," Whitfield said without looking up from his notes, "can we take 5 minutes?" Dr. Aguilar glanced at the clock on the wall. 10 minutes, she said. "We'll reconvene." Claudia and I went to the small waiting area at the end of the hall. She poured herself coffee from a carafe on a side table and offered me some. I took it. "She didn't expect the medical documentation," Claudia said quietly. "No, or the timeline." I wrapped my hands around the paper cup. She expected me to show up with the police report and a request for supervised visits, and then she expected to negotiate it down to nothing. Claudia looked at me. "She still might try. I know. How are you holding up?" The question surprised me because she had not asked it before. She was efficient and specific and thorough, and not typically oriented toward the emotional condition of her clients during process. I thought about it honestly. "I feel very calm," I said. "I don't know if that's good or bad." "It is both," Claudia said, and finished her coffee. When we went back to the conference room, Whitfield had a different posture. He was still professional. He was still competent. But he had stopped leading and started managing, which are 2 very different stances, and the shift was visible. "My client would like to propose a path forward," he said. My mother's hands were back on the table. She was looking just past my left shoulder in the way she looked when she had made a calculation and was delivering its conclusion. "What path?" Claudia said. "A formal written apology, delivered to Nora Scott and to both children in age-appropriate language. A commitment to no physical discipline of any kind in any circumstance. A supervised visitation arrangement for the transition period, with supervision agreed upon by both parties, not court-assigned." A pause. I looked at Claudia. "And," Whitfield continued, "my client would ask that the police matter be treated as a resolved family issue and not pursued further." The room was very quiet for a moment. Not dramatic silence, just the kind of quiet that follows when the air has been taken out of a particular position. Claudia set her pen down. "The police matter is not within my client's authority to resolve. The case number was assigned by responding officers acting on their own assessment. Whether any charges proceed is not a decision my client controls." She looked at Whitfield steadily. "My client controls is whether she seeks a restraining order which she is positioned to receive given the active documentation." My mother looked at me directly then, the first direct look since we had sat down. Her voice was different, lower. Something in it had gone thin in a way I had not heard before, a quality of material under pressure. "You would take my grandchildren from me entirely." "You took yourself from them," I said, "the moment you hit Lily in that store." Helen made a sound. She covered her mouth with both hands. It was not a gasp, it was a small, helpless sound, the sound of a person who has been standing in the wrong place for a long time and has just been shown a photograph of where they were standing. "I was correcting her," my mother said, and for the first time the words did not arrive with their usual finish. They arrived unsteady, like a table with one short leg. "She reached for candy." My voice was level. "She is 7 years old. She reached for candy." Nothing came back across the table. My mother looked at the folder. She looked at her hands. She looked at Whitfield, who had the careful expression of a man who knew his client had just lost the center of her argument and was waiting to see if it would be rebuilt or if the building was done. It was done. The written apology arrived 11 days later, drafted formally and reviewed by Claudia before I accepted it. It acknowledged the incident, acknowledged that physical discipline had not been appropriate, and committed in writing to no physical contact of any kind with either child. Claudia had added specific language about the enforceability of that commitment given the existing police case number, which meant any future incident would be treated not as a first offense, but as a violation of a documented written commitment. I accepted it. Not because it was enough, it was not enough, not entirely, and I knew that, but because Lily and Daniel were children who deserved the option of a grandmother who could behave appropriately, even if the path to that behavior had required a conference room, 2 attorneys, and a police case number to achieve. The protective order petition was held in reserve, not withdrawn. Claudia explained it as a loaded chamber. Available. Specific. Not fired unless needed. My mother did not call me for 6 weeks after the mediation. When she finally called, she did not mention the conference room. She asked if the children were well. I said they were. She asked if Daniel was still in the advanced program. I said he was. There was a pause on her end that lasted long enough to be its own kind of statement. I heard you bought a property, she said. On Mercer Lane. Yes. I didn't know. I know you didn't. Another pause. Are you doing well, Nora? I thought about the past 6 weeks. About Daniel sitting in his socks in my bedroom doorway, needing to know if he had done the right thing. About Lily, who had bounced back with the resilience of a 7-year-old who is deeply and consistently loved, who had not mentioned her grandmother once since that Thursday, and who had started a new art project at Dr. Osai's clinic involving watercolors, and which she was extremely serious about. About the trust documents in David Ewan's secure digital file. About the Mercer Lane property, both units occupied, generating rent that arrived on the first of every month with the reliable quiet of something built on a solid foundation. Yes, I said, I'm doing very well. My grandmother Estella called me 2 days after that. She had found out about the mediation through Helen, who had apparently told her everything. Estella did not ask questions, and she did not offer assessment. She said 3 things: that she was glad the children were safe, that she had known for a long time that this day was coming, and that she was proud of me. Then she asked if I would bring the children to visit her the following Sunday, just us, not the whole family. We went. Estella made hot chocolate and put too much sugar in Lily's because Lily had asked for extra sweet and Estella believed in honoring a direct request. Daniel ate most of the cookies she had made, the plain butter ones, and Estella sat in her chair and watched my children in her kitchen with an expression I did not have a word for, but that felt, to me, like the clearest and most uncomplicated form of love I had been in the presence of in a very long time. That was October into November into December. By the new year, the Mercer Lane property had been refinanced under slightly better terms that James Ockhafer had identified, and I had opened preliminary conversations with him about a second acquisition. The Children's Trust accounts continued to grow. Daniel tested into the next tier of the advanced program in January, which his teacher Mizarajo had predicted he would. Lily's auditory processing work with Dr. Osai was progressing well enough that Dr. Osai had mentioned the possibility of reducing session frequency in the spring, not because coverage was an issue. It was not, but because Lily was developing the tools she needed and needed fewer external supports to use them. My mother and I have a supervised relationship now. The visits happen at my house, not hers, with me present throughout. Lily is polite to her. Daniel is watchful in the way 9-year-olds are watchful when they have assessed a situation once and decided to keep monitoring it. My mother keeps her hands to herself. She has not smoothed the front of her blouse in my presence since November. I do not know if she has changed or if she has simply adjusted to the conditions of the only access she has left. Both are possible. The difference matters to me somewhat less than it used to. The thing I think about most, still, is Daniel in that aisle, setting down his cereal box with both hands, turning, walking to the front of the store. Not running, not yelling, not waiting for me to act first. He was 9 years old and he understood, clearly and completely, what the appropriate response to harm was, and he made it without hesitation, without asking permission. I did not teach him that in a single lesson. I taught him that in 700 small moments over 9 years, every time I said something that happened was not acceptable, every time I showed him what it looked like to handle a difficult situation with your head and not your fear. He was the evidence of all of it. He still is. So did I go too far, or not far enough? I genuinely want to know what you think.